Get your filthy hands away from that piano. Catherine Whitmore's diamond-studded hand shoved Ethan Miller's cleaning cart aside, sending mop water sloshing across the marble floor of the Meridian Club. 200 of Manhattan's richest froze, their champagne glasses midair, as the billionaire heiress jabbed a manicured finger toward the $180,000 Steinway Grand. This instrument costs more than your entire bloodline will ever be worth. Nervous laughter rippled through the ballroom. Then Catherine's lips curled into a cruel smile. Tell you what, if you can play this piece without failing, I'll marry you on the spot. The crowd erupted in savage amusement. Phones lifted, hashtags exploded, and the janitor's dignity became their entertainment. The 4:30 a.m. subway car rattled through the tunnels beneath Brooklyn, a tired serpent of steel carrying the city's forgotten. Ethan Miller sat hunched in the corner, his reflection staring back at him from the grimy window. A young man who looked older than his years, shoulders bowed, not from age but from responsibility. At 29, he wore the face of someone who had buried his father, raised his sister, and watched his mother fade beneath fluorescent hospital lights. His hands, however, told another story. Long fingers stretched from his gloves, the kind of hands once meant to caress ivory keys, now roughened by bleach and ammonia. Calluses pressed into the fabric where elegance once resided. Those hands had once summoned applause from audiences who had stood for him. Tonight, they gripped the steel pole of a subway car as if it were the last thing tethering him to reality. The train screeched into Atlantic Avenue. Ethan rose with weary precision, adjusting the strap of his worn backpack. In it lay little more than cleaning supplies, a change of shirt, and the gold watch his grandfather had given his father, now passed down to him, a small inheritance carrying the weight of promise. He touched it absent-mindedly, feeling the tick of time against his wrist. Each second seemed to whisper the same reminder. You are running out of it. By 5:15, Ethan pushed through the revolving doors of the Meridian Club, where Manhattan's elite came to play in a gilded playground built on the backs of men like him. The lobby gleamed with Persian rugs worth more than brownstones in Queens. Oil paintings older than the nation hung on walls lit by chandeliers dripping with crystal. Even the air seemed filtered, scented with imported jasmine. To its members, this was simply atmosphere. To Ethan, it was another reminder of the worlds he would never belong to. He moved silently through the marble expanse, mop in hand, bucket rolling behind. The night crew had already vanished, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the ghostly echoes of conversations he would never be invited into. 7 years of this. 7 years since the scaffolding collapse that stole his father and stole his future. Once, professors at Howard University had called him extraordinary. Once, the Manhattan School of Music had written his name on a full scholarship letter. But 3 days after his father's funeral, he had folded that letter, placed it in a drawer, and walked into a life of invisible servitude. Son, his father had whispered with lungs full of dust and blood. Take care of them. Ethan had promised, and promises had weight heavier than piano lids. At 6 o'clock sharp, his cart rattled past the club's music room. Through beveled glass doors, the Steinway grand piano sat like a sleeping giant, its lid closed, its surface reflecting the first rays of dawn breaking across Manhattan's skyline. On the music stand lay Chopin's Ballade No. 1, the very piece Catherine Whitmore had mocked him with just hours earlier. His hands twitched involuntarily, the muscle memory of 10,000 hours waking in his fingertips. 4 years of conservatory training lived dormant inside him. Each scale, each sonata, each midnight etude coiled like a spring waiting for release. Professors had once told him, Ethan, you don't play music, you speak it. But music didn't pay rent, didn't cover dialysis, didn't feed a 17-year-old sister with a head full of dreams. He paused at the glass door longer than usual, eyes tracing the black sheen of the Steinway. For a fleeting second, he could hear it, the thunder of octaves, the whisper of legato lines, the kind of sound that filled halls and silenced doubters. But the echo faded quickly, drowned out by the squeak of his mop bucket wheel. He pushed on. Survival demanded invisibility. In Bed-Stuy, their apartment barely measured 420 square feet. The living room belonged not to family photos, but to medical equipment, humming and blinking in the corner like a second heartbeat. His mother's dialysis machine dominated the space, the tubes and monitors a cruel reminder of the debt life exacted. Sophia's textbooks and notebooks blanketed the kitchen table, her lamp the only reliable source of light since the ceiling bulb had gone out. Ethan's bed was an air mattress shoved against the wall, leaking air every night until it sagged beneath him by dawn. The smell of antiseptic clung to the furniture, mingling with the quiet determination of a household refusing to collapse. On the counter, a stack of unopened envelopes bore names like Columbia, Barnard, NYU, Sophia's acceptance letters, dreams sealed in paper he hadn't had the courage to open because tuition felt as unreachable as Mars. And yet, despite the poverty, despite the relentless march of responsibility, there was music, not here, not in this apartment, but at Lincoln Center every Tuesday and Thursday night when Harold Johnson, the security guard, slid him the keys to practice room C. These hands weren't made for mops, Harold had said the first time, catching Ethan humming while scrubbing marble steps. 6 months later, those clandestine sessions had become sanctuary. The upright piano was battered, its sustain pedal sticky, 3 of its keys dead. But in that small room, Ethan became himself again. Last Thursday, he had played Chopin's Ballade No. 1 pouring into it 7 years of silence, 7 years of grief, 7 years of swallowed brilliance. Harold had stood in the doorway afterward, tears streaking his weathered face. That wasn't playing, he'd whispered. That was praying. But prayers didn't pay $45,000 for surgery. Prayers didn't keep landlords at bay. Prayers didn't hold Columbia's deadline at the end of the week, demanding Sophia submit a music supplement recorded by a pianist capable of doing her composition justice. His phone buzzed in the pocket of his coveralls as he polished the club's banisters. A text from Sophia. Mom's session ran long. Doctor wants to talk about the surgery. The number alone was enough to suffocate him. $45,000. They didn't have $45 to spare. The mop squeaked across marble as Ethan's movements grew sharper, each stroke deliberate, as if he were conducting a silent symphony. Somewhere between Catherine Whitmore's cruel laughter and Sophia's urgent deadline, he realized invisibility wasn't protection anymore. It was prison. By 8 o'clock, the Meridian Club began to stir with life. Valets pulled luxury cars into line, the air filled with the scent of leather interiors and designer perfume. Ethan kept his head down, scrubbing fingerprints from glass doors, but he felt the shift in atmosphere before it arrived. Catherine Whitmore entered like a storm dressed in couture. Her midnight blue Bentley glided to a stop, and before the valet could open the door, she stepped out, Louis Vuitton heels striking the marble like a metronome. Platinum blonde hair caught the sun, reflecting a glow as cold as steel. The Whitmore family name was etched in brass beside Rockefeller and Vanderbilt on the club's donor wall. Old money, the kind that never had to announce itself because the world already knew. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," the concierge said, his voice reverent. She didn't respond. Acknowledgement was currency she didn't waste on staff. Flanked by her entourage, James Morrison, her CFO, Dr. Whitman, her physician, and Rebecca Parker, her publicist, she cut through the lobby like a knife through silk. Every detail of her appearance was calculated. Chanel suit tailored to perfection, diamond tennis bracelet sourced from 3 continents, a 10-carat ring on her finger, though she had never been married. The ring wasn't about love, it was about dominance. The group entered the grand ballroom, where staff rushed to assemble banners and adjust lighting for that night's wellness gala. 200 of the most powerful people in America would arrive soon, senators and CEOs mingling beneath crystal chandeliers, praising Catherine's supposed philanthropy even as her company tripled insulin prices. Her ice blue gaze swept across the ballroom until it froze on the Steinway Grand at center stage. "Why is that here?" she demanded, James stammered, scrolling through his tablet. The committee thought live classical music might elevate the atmosphere. Very sophisticated. Catherine rolled the word across her tongue like bitter wine. "And who is performing?" James scrolled faster, sweat beading on his forehead. "It doesn't specify. I believe it's decorative." Catherine approached the piano, her heels tapping against marble like a judge approaching the bench. She ran a manicured finger along the polished ebony surface, not leaving a trace. "Do you play?" she asked a nearby worker. The man shook his head nervously. "No, ma'am, I just—" "Of course you don't," Catherine interrupted, her laugh like breaking glass. "Silly of me to ask." But even as she dismissed him, her mind was working. Tonight's gala needed spectacle, not just wealth on display, but power, something unforgettable, something that would trend beyond hashtags and stock tickers. Her eyes lingered on the piano, predatory calculation flashing like lightning. Ethan, pushing his cart past the service entrance, caught sight of her through the glass. She turned, their eyes locking for a fraction of a second. Recognition, calculation, a cruel smile spreading across her lips. The words she had hissed that morning echoed through Ethan's mind. "Play this piano and I'll marry you." Only now, he realized, that had been rehearsal. Tonight would be the performance. And in that moment, between the gleam of Catherine's bracelet and the weight of his grandfather's watch, Ethan Miller felt something stir inside him. Not anger, not fear, but resolve. The kind that comes when you've been invisible for too long, and you finally decide to be seen. By evening, the Meridian Club had shed its quiet opulence and transformed into a stage glittering with power. Crystal chandeliers blazed overhead, their light refracting across marble floors polished so flawlessly they reflected each guest like a second, richer version of themselves. Oil paintings of long-dead aristocrats gazed down on the living heirs of empire, approving silently as wealth paraded itself in gowns and tuxedos worth more than city blocks. The guest list was a constellation of influence. Senators leaned against pharmaceutical moguls. Tech billionaires swapped jokes with European nobility. Socialites floated in silk like exotic butterflies feeding on champagne. The air carried the perfume of wealth layered atop the faint musk of ambition. This was no simple gala. It was a declaration of hierarchy, a reminder of who held dominion over Manhattan. At the center of it all stood Catherine Whitmore, draped in midnight blue Valentino, diamonds sparking from her wrists like weaponized starlight. She didn't walk through the ballroom. She reigned. Conversations bent toward her orbit. Laughter rose when she smiled. Even the waitstaff straightened when she passed, their silence a kind of reverence forced by fear. Rebecca Parker, her publicist, hovered close with a phone already live streaming to Catherine's millions of curated followers. "The Wellness Gala hashtag is trending," she murmured. 2.3 million impressions since this morning. Catherine's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Her company's insulin prices had risen 300% last quarter. But tonight she stood framed as a champion of health and compassion. That irony wasn't a liability, it was strategy. "Optics," she often told her board, "outweigh mathematics." But tonight, optics needed something more. Something viral, something unforgettable. Her eyes drifted again to the Steinway grand piano positioned at center stage. Its black surface gleamed under the chandeliers, polished to a mirror that reflected her world back at her. She had mocked Ethan Miller beside this very instrument only hours before, reducing him to a punchline for the privilege. The memory lingered sweet on her tongue. "Ladies and gentlemen," Catherine's voice rose across the ballroom, instantly commanding silence. She had perfected this tone years ago, a cross between royalty and prosecutor. Before we begin tonight's formal program, I must share something troubling. Phones lifted like a field of glowing flowers. Every guest knew instinctively. When Catherine Whitmore labeled something troubling, it was entertainment. This morning, she continued, her blue eyes sweeping across the crowd with calculated gravity, I discovered one of our custodial staff studying this piano. She gestured toward the Steinway. Not cleaning it, not maintaining it, studying it, as if someone from his background could possibly comprehend such artistry. Nervous laughter rippled through the room. Some guests sipped champagne to hide their smirks. Others leaned closer, eager to see cruelty masquerade as a spectacle. Near the service entrance, Ethan froze. He had been refilling water glasses, moving with the invisibility that had protected him for years. But Catherine's words pinned him to the wall like a specimen under glass. He knew what was coming. "Ethan Miller," she called, her tone scalpel sharp. "Would you join us? Please?" 200 heads turned. For a moment, Ethan considered retreating, slipping through the service corridor and vanishing into safety. But safety was suffocation. He stepped forward, the weight of every gaze pressing against him like gravity. Catherine's smile widened, theatrical and cruel. "This man," she told the crowd, "believed himself worthy of our Steinway. This instrument costs more than most people earn in 5 years. It requires training, breeding, culture, qualities that surely he cannot possess." Laughter scattered again. Rebecca's phone captured every second, the live feed exploding with comments. "Rich people are savage. This is brutal. What's she about to do? But I am feeling generous," Catherine purred, her voice dipping into a conspiratorial whisper that still carried across the ballroom. "After all, this is a charity event, so I will make him a proposition." She turned, drawing every pair of eyes toward the piano. With deliberate elegance, she removed the velvet box from her purse and placed it atop the music stand. Inside gleamed her infamous 10-carat ring. "If Ethan can play even the opening measures of Chopin's Ballade No. 1, she announced, "I will marry him right here, tonight." Gasps and delighted laughter erupted. Someone shouted, "Victoria, you're savage!" Another voice called, "This poor guy doesn't know what he's in for." Catherine extended her hand toward the piano with a flourish, her bracelet scattering diamonds across the marble. "There is your prize, darling. All you have to do is earn it." The crowd surged closer, forming a semicircle around the Steinway like spectators in a coliseum. Phones lifted higher, streams multiplying across platforms. The hashtag #Whitmore Gala Challenge flared to life. Ethan stood frozen, his pulse hammering. He felt their hunger for humiliation, the anticipation of watching him stumble through impossible music. The trap was perfect. Decline, and he'd prove her point, too small, too weak, too uncultured to belong. Accept, and he'd almost certainly fail in front of the most powerful eyes in the city. "Unless," Catherine added sweetly, "you prefer to return to your proper duties." The silence was suffocating. Each second stretched, honey thick, under the weight of 200 expectations. Phones recorded his hesitation, eager to capture failure in high definition. And then, faint but clear, Ethan heard another voice, his grandfather's, echoing across decades. "They can take your money, your job, even your dreams, but they cannot take what God put in your hands." His gaze dropped to the gold watch at his wrist, the inheritance of sweat and sacrifice, legacy ticking steady beneath his skin. He thought of his mother on dialysis, of Sophia's acceptance letters, of the promise made to his father on a hospital bed. And he realized humiliation wasn't the worst outcome. Invisibility was. Ethan raised his head, spine straightening, shoulders squaring. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that shifted the very air. "I accept your proposal, Ms. Whitmore, and when I'm finished, I expect you to honor it." The crowd stirred. This wasn't the timid compliance Catherine had choreographed. This was defiance. This was a man stepping out of the shadows. He moved toward the Steinway. Each step echoed like a drumbeat of destiny, his work boots silent against Persian rugs. The room fell utterly still, anticipation thick enough to taste. 200 of Manhattan's elite held their breath, waiting to watch him fail. Catherine stood beside the piano, diamond smile gleaming. "Ladies and gentlemen, Chopin's Ballade. Numero 1, she declared. One of the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire." Rebecca angled her phone for maximum coverage. The live stream comment section exploded. "This is going to be painful. $10 says he doesn't make it past the first line." "Is this even real?" Ethan lowered himself onto the bench. His hands hovered above the keys, fingers trembling not with fear, but with potential energy. The kind of energy that could shatter assumptions. The Steinway gleamed before him, every key a door to the life he'd buried. For 7 years, Ethan Miller had been invisible. Tonight, invisibility itself was on trial. The ballroom was suffocatingly silent. Not the polite hush of cultured society before a concert, but the electric stillness of predators watching prey. 200 of Manhattan's most powerful men and women leaned forward as Ethan Miller placed his hands above the keys. They weren't expecting music. They were expecting comedy. A janitor fumbling with Chopin like a child juggling knives. Phones hovered like vultures, red recording dots glowing against the chandeliers. Whitmore Gala Challenge trended upward in real time. The stage was set for his humiliation. Ethan exhaled slowly, a breath drawn not just from lungs but from memory, from every late night spent in a Lincoln Center practice room, every hour stolen from exhaustion to keep his artistry alive. His grandfather's watch ticked steadily against his wrist. He closed his eyes. When the first note came, it was so soft it seemed accidental, a whisper of sound that nevertheless bent the room towards silence. Then another, precise, deliberate, delicate as glass, the melody of Chopin's Ballade No. One emerged not as an attempt, but as a revelation, as if the piano had been waiting years for these exact hands. The crowd shifted, smirks faltered, champagne glasses lowered. The janitor was not fumbling. He was commanding. By measure 8, Ethan's shoulders had settled into the familiar posture his professors once called regal. His wrists floated, fingers gliding with impossible ease. Notes poured into the air like silk unraveling, phrases breathing with the same rhythm as his chest. The Steinway's voice filled the ballroom, richer and deeper than it had ever sounded in this space of empty prestige. Dr. Whitman's champagne glass froze halfway to his lips. "That's actually quite sophisticated," he muttered. Count DeMarco, the Italian nobleman known for his collection of Stradivari violins, leaned forward, eyes narrowing with recognition. "Maria," he whispered to his wife, "listen to the touch. That is not amateur playing." The phones that had been raised to capture humiliation now recorded wonder. Comment feeds lit up with disbelief. "Is this real? Who is this guy? He's incredible." Catherine Whitmore's smile tightened. She had orchestrated humiliation. But what she was watching was mastery. She told herself it was luck, that he would falter soon. Yet each measure deepened her unease. The ballade swelled into its B section, octaves ringing like cathedral bells, arpeggios cascading like water over marble. Ethan's face reflected the storm inside the music, tender in lyrical passages, fierce in dramatic outbursts. His body moved with the rhythm, not theatrical, but organic, as though the music was coursing through him rather than being performed. The ballroom transformed. Executives accustomed to discussing mergers leaned forward like parishioners in church. Senators who measured words for votes sat wordless. Even Rebecca Parker's live stream fell momentarily quiet, the comments scrolling too fast to catch. "I'm literally crying. This is Carnegie Hall level. A janitor? No way." Catherine's diamonded hand trembled on the piano's edge. This was not possible. Men who mopped floors did not command Chopin. Janitors did not summon tears from nobility. The world she believed in, the neat categories of breeding, education, and worth, was crumbling with each flawless phrase. The development section arrived. Treacherous passages even conservatory graduates dreaded. Ethan attacked them with a confidence born not of arrogance, but of survival. His fingers blurred, yet every note struck clean, crystalline, precise. He slowed impossible runs just enough to wring their emotion dry, then exploded into cascades of sound that made the chandeliers vibrate. Count DeMarco rose to his feet without realizing it, tears streaming down his face. "Magnifico," he whispered. "This is La Scala, 1987. This is that level." Gasps spread as Ethan entered the cadenza. His hands split into independent voices, left thundering octaves, right spinning runs so fast they seemed superhuman. Every pianist in the room knew. This was the graveyard of reputations. Catherine herself had once stumbled here as a child during forced lessons. Yet Ethan soared, bending the impossible into inevitability. Phones shook in trembling hands. Rebecca's feed surged to 100,000 live viewers. Comments exploding. "This is insane. He's not a janitor. He's a genius. I can't stop crying." And then, the silence, that sacred pause before the final section, stretched into eternity. The room held its breath. 200 powerful people realized they weren't witnessing humiliation. They were witnessing history. When Ethan's hands descended again, it was controlled lightning. Bass thunder shook the marble. Melodies soared like cathedral choirs. He poured 7 years of invisibility, sacrifice, and deferred dreams into each chord. Generations of silenced ancestors played through him, demanding to be heard. The final chord rang like a declaration of war. He held the sustained pedal, letting harmonies decay into reverent silence. For 4 long seconds, no one moved. Then the eruption began. Count DeMarco led the standing ovation, his hands clapping thunderously. "Bravo!" he shouted, voice breaking. "Magnifico!" Senators rose. CEOs followed. Nobility wept. The ballroom thundered with applause, not just for music, but for revelation. Rebecca's live stream shot past 250,000 viewers. The hashtag shifted. No longer New Year Whitmore Gala Challenge. Now it was Janitor Genius. Comments flooded. "This man deserves Carnegie Hall. Victoria Whitmore just made herself look like a fool. I want his album right now." Ethan stood slowly, sweat glistening, chest rising and falling. His uniform clung to him, but it was no longer a janitor's outfit. It was the armor of triumph. He turned to Catherine, meeting her ice-blue eyes directly. "Ms. Whitmore," he said calmly, "I believe you have a wedding to plan." The ballroom roared with laughter and applause. Whistles pierced the air. "He got her!" someone shouted. "She walked right into that one." Catherine's face flushed crimson, her carefully sculpted authority collapsing. The engagement ring sat mocking atop the piano. The trap she had set had become her noose. Ethan placed his work gloves beside the ring with deliberate precision. "The pleasure," he said softly, "was all mine." The applause doubled. Manhattan's elite, who had arrived expecting to laugh at a janitor, were now fighting to be first in line to claim association with him. Business cards flew from tuxedo pockets. The director of Lincoln Center pushed forward, voice carrying, "Sir, you don't belong cleaning our stages. You belong on them." The ovation didn't stop. It intensified, wave after wave. For the first time in 7 years, Ethan Miller was no longer invisible. He was unforgettable. The ovation refused to die. It rolled through the ballroom like a storm that had been waiting years to break. People who had never stood for anything stood now, clapping, shouting, whistling until their throats burned. The chandeliers shook from the force of it. champagne sloshed over crystal rims. A senator dabbed his eyes with his cuff, unapologetic. Tech moguls with portfolios bigger than nations stared as if they'd just seen God step into a janitor's body. Ethan Miller didn't bow. He stood straight, letting the noise crash over him like ocean waves. 7 years of invisibility had dissolved in a single performance. He was no longer the man who mopped their floors. He was the man who had forced them to listen. Rebecca Parker's live stream went supernova. 500,000 viewers, then 6, then 7. Comments detonated across the screen faster than she could read. This is the greatest thing I've ever witnessed. Someone sign him now. Janitor genius is trending worldwide. Phones all over the ballroom vibrated with alerts, tweets, news pings, viral hashtags racing through Manhattan like wildfire. Outside, on the street, Uber drivers were talking about it before their passengers had even closed the doors. Uptown, Columbia students streamed the performance on dorm TVs, some recognizing Ethan instantly. In Brooklyn, a dialysis nurse turned her screen toward his mother's hospital bed. Tears ran down her cheeks as she whispered, "That's your boy." At the edge of the ballroom, Catherine Whitmore stood frozen. Her perfect smile had curdled into something grotesque. The ring she had placed atop the piano glared back at her like an indictment. She reached for it, but Ethan's work gloves lay beside it, a reminder of who had won. Cameras caught the image instantly. A billionaire's 10-carat ring humbled beside a janitor's gloves. By morning, it would appear on magazine covers worldwide. "Magnificent!" Count DeMarco shouted again, tears streaking his aristocratic face. "This man must perform at Carnegie Hall." "Carnegie?" someone echoed. "He deserves the world." The Lincoln Center director pushed through the throng, business card in hand. "Ethan Miller, my name is Thomas Berkowitz, artistic director. You belong with us. Residency, debut recital, whatever you want." Deutsche Gramophone's A&R chief muscled forward. "Mr. Miller, I'll sign you tonight. We'll make a record that shakes the industry." More cards appeared, record executives, talent scouts, philanthropists. Offers came in waves, a feeding frenzy around the man who had just torn down the walls of elitism with 10 fingers. Ethan didn't reach for any card. He stood steady, still catching his breath, the gold of his grandfather's watch gleaming beneath stage lights. His eyes drifted not to the crowd, not to Catherine, but to the service entrance. There stood Harold Johnson, the Lincoln Center guard who had given him midnight access to a broken piano. Harold's cheeks were wet. His lips trembled. "I told you," he shouted, voice cracking with pride. "Those hands weren't made for mops." The ballroom pivoted. Phones swiveled. Cameras caught Ethan crossing the stage, arms outstretched, embracing the older man. The ovation swelled again, this time for both of them. Student and mentor, janitor and security guard, invisible men rendered visible together. Ethan lifted Harold's hand high. "This man," he told the crowd, his voice carrying across marble and crystal, "believed in me when no one else did. Without him, tonight never happens." The applause redirected, a tidal wave crashing over Harold, his face buried in his hands, overwhelmed. The image captured live was instantly iconic. Two working men in uniform standing in the glow of a Steinway, receiving more honor than most billionaires had earned in lifetimes. And then Ethan heard the sound he'd been waiting for all evening. A voice calling through the crowd, frantic, desperate, familiar. "Ethan!" It was Sophia. His sister pushed through tuxedos and gowns, still in her Columbia sweatshirt, hair wild from running blocks from the subway. She stumbled into the light, eyes wide, chest heaving. "You're everywhere," she gasped. "Twitter, TikTok, Facebook. Mom's watching from the hospital. She's crying. Ethan, happy crying. And..." Her words broke into sobs. "Someone paid for it. The surgery. It's covered. An anonymous donor wired the full amount. For the first time that night, Ethan's composure cracked. His breath hitched. The years of wait, of debt, of broken nights and swallowed dreams, all of it ripped loose. He pulled Sophia into his chest and held her as if he could stop time. Applause blurred into noise. Lights blurred into gold. This, not the ovation, was his victory. In the corner, Catherine Whitmore's phone buzzed relentlessly. Her CFO whispered frantically, "Stock prices collapsing. Hashtags are ripping through every platform. Harrison Cross just tweeted, he's establishing a $50 million scholarship fund in your honor. He's stealing your narrative." She stared at the Steinway, at the gloves, at the ring, at Ethan's arms wrapped around his sister. Her empire trembled beneath her stilettos. Everything she had built on cruelty and control was slipping into another man's hands, a man she had tried to break. The ballroom shifted again as another voice rose. 100 million, gasps. Jennifer Park, a tech billionaire in a crimson gown, stepped forward. Full scholarships for working-class artists, because tonight proved we've been looking in the wrong places. Applause roared again. More pledges followed. In less than 10 minutes, over $300 million had been promised for overlooked talent, all inspired by a janitor who had played piano. Ethan's phone buzzed like a hornet's nest. His Facebook page ballooned from a few hundred friends to 50,000 followers in 15 minutes. A GoFundMe for his mother's recovery, created by a stranger watching Rebecca's livestream, hit $100,000 before he even knew it existed. In the chaos, Thomas Berkowitz gripped his shoulder again. "Mr. Miller, you're wasted here. You're a star. Carnegie Hall. 3 months. Headline debut. Will you accept?" The room hushed, holding its collective breath. Ethan's eyes swept the crowd. Nobility, executives, senators, all waiting on his answer. For years, he had been ignored. Now, the world demanded his decision. He glanced at Sophia, her tear-streaked face glowing with pride. He thought of his mother, still watching on a hospital screen, her tears of joy flowing into the sheets. He thought of his father, whispering in a construction ward, "Take care of them. I'll finish my shift," Ethan said quietly, but firmly. And then, "Yes, I accept." The ballroom erupted once more, louder than ever. This time the ovation wasn't just for music. It was for resilience, for defiance, for the revelation that talent is everywhere, even in places the powerful never bother to look. And as applause thundered through the Meridian Club, Catherine Whitmore stood alone in the shadows of her own event, a queen dethroned by the man she had tried to humiliate. 3 months later, the air outside Carnegie Hall carried the crisp bite of early spring. Spotlights painted the sky above Manhattan, carving golden streaks into the night. A crowd stretched around the block, tuxedos and gowns spilling across sidewalks where ticket scalpers shouted impossible numbers. Inside, every seat was filled. Tech moguls, senators, nobility, students who had camped outside in the cold. Even the ushers moved differently, aware that they were hosting not just a concert, but a coronation. The posters outside bore a name no one had known before the Whitmore Gala: Ethan Miller, piano recital, Chopin Ballade, Nacha, one below it. A tagline chosen by the Lincoln Center's marketing team, but whispered first by the internet: Rakshi, janitor genius. Backstage, Ethan adjusted his tuxedo. It was perfectly tailored, but the gold watch on his wrist was the real crown. His grandfather's inheritance gleamed beneath stage lights, ticking steadily toward destiny. Beside him, Sophia fussed with his collar, radiant in a gown loaned by one of the designers who had begged to dress her. "Mom's in the front row," she whispered, voice shaking with pride. "She's glowing. She looks 10 years younger." His mother sat near the stage, dialysis of memory replaced by new health purchased with the generosity of strangers. Tears already shimmered in her eyes. She wasn't just here to watch her son perform. She was here to watch him live the life her husband had died believing he deserved. And there, in the second row, sat Harold Johnson, wearing a suit he'd never dreamed of owning, purchased by an anonymous donor who had seen his role in Ethan's rise. He sat upright, face glowing, the man who had opened a practice room door, now watching it open to the world. When Ethan stepped onto the stage, the ovation began before he touched the keys. It rolled across the hall, breaking decorum, shattering the usual polite applause of Carnegie audiences. They stood, cheering, whistling, not just for music, but for the man who had turned humiliation into triumph. He bowed once, simple, understated, then lowered himself onto the bench. His hands hovered above the Steinway, the same model that had nearly been his gallows 3 months earlier. Silence stretched like an overture. He closed his eyes, breathing deep. The first notes came like sunrise, gentle, patient, each one shimmering through the hall like light spilling over mountains. Ballad no, one again. But this time it wasn't defiance, it was liberation. His phrasing carried not bitterness, but grace, not anger, but gratitude. Every rise and fall of melody told the story of scaffolding collapses and scholarship letters, of midnight practice rooms and dialysis machines, of janitors' gloves laid beside diamond rings. The music built, swelling into passages that once symbolized pain, now reborn as proof. Arpeggios cascaded like rivers set free. Octaves thundered, not with rage, but with joy. In the front row, Sophia clutched their mother's hand. Harold's tears flowed freely, his lips moving in silent prayer. Ethan's body moved with the piece, not fighting it, not conquering it, but riding it like a wave he had been born to surf. By the cadenza, the hall was breathless. By the final chord, silence pressed so heavy it felt like the earth itself had paused. Then the eruption. Carnegie Hall roared. The ovation rose, wave after wave. Applause so thunderous it seemed to shake the rafters. People shouted his name. Others sobbed openly. Flowers rained from balconies. In one corner, the director of Lincoln Center whispered to his colleagues, "This is history. Tonight we witnessed history." Ethan stood slowly, chest heaving, sweat glistening, but face serene. He bowed once more. He had arrived. But outside those golden walls, another story was unraveling. Catherine Whitmore, once queen of the Meridian Club, now lived cloistered in her Hampton estate. The board of Whitmore Pharmaceuticals had forced her out within weeks of the gala disaster. Shareholders fled as hashtags became boycotts. Harrison Cross, her rival, had scooped up her empire piece by piece, turning her name into a foundation for overlooked talent, a bitter irony that headlines never let her escape. Her Steinway sat in her mansion's music room, covered in dust. She had once believed it a symbol of her power. Now it was a tombstone for her arrogance. She never touched it again. Back inside Carnegie, the evening pressed forward. Ethan was no longer introduced as janitor or prodigy. He was introduced as a pianist. Full stop, critics wrote feverishly in their notebooks, already composing reviews destined for front pages. Words like transcendent, revelatory, once in a generation spilled from their pens. Yet for Ethan, the reviews didn't matter. What mattered was the look on his mother's face, alive and proud. What mattered was Sophia's hand in his, her future no longer deferred, but blazing bright. What mattered was Harold's embrace afterward, the old man whispering, "I told you, I told you." By midnight, when the hall had emptied and the city's noise reclaimed the night, Ethan stood alone on stage. He touched the keys one last time. Soft, personal, a prayer whispered into silence. He wasn't playing for Carnegie now. He was playing for his father, for every ancestor silenced by survival, for every invisible man or woman still mopping floors with music in their veins. And when the final note faded, he stood straighter than he ever had before, because the truth was simple. Excellence does not ask for permission. It does not need privilege to exist. It waits in silence until someone listens. Ethan Miller had been invisible. Now he was unforgettable. And so the story ends not with a billionaire's cruelty, but with a janitor's triumph. Not with humiliation, but with revelation. Proof that talent wears no uniform, genius needs no pedigree, and dignity cannot be bought or broken.